The evening air was warm, the kind of night when most people were winding down and heading home. Traffic was light, and the main road through town was unusually quiet. Two patrol officers drove their usual route, scanning the street for anything out of place. Nothing about the scene suggested danger, only routine. Then they noticed a black sedan traveling just ahead. One of the car's taillights flickered weakly before going completely dark. It was the sort of minor violation that rarely led to more than a quick stop and a warning. Without hesitation, the officers activated their lights, expecting another simple interaction. The sedan slowed and pulled to the side of the road. At first glance, the vehicle looked like any other family car. Clean exterior, no signs of damage, and no indication of trouble. Yet something about the way it stopped seemed hesitant, as though the driver needed extra time to collect herself before rolling to a halt. The officers approached cautiously, more out of habit than concern. When they reached the window, they were met with a sight that immediately shifted the mood of the stop. Behind the wheel sat a woman in her late 30s. Her hair was neatly tied back, her clothes simple and tidy, but her hands told a different story. They gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. She avoided direct eye contact, glancing instead at the dashboard as if hitching for a distraction. It was the look of someone bracing for something far more serious than a broken taillight. The officers exchanged a quick glance. Their training had taught them to read body language, and this driver's behavior was a clear sign of distress. Still, outwardly, nothing seemed criminal, as though. They asked for her license and registration, and she fumbled slightly as she handed them over. The documents were valid, the address matched, and her record came back clean. By all accounts, she was an ordinary resident. Yet the atmosphere around the stop continued to feel uneasy. As the officers lingered by the car, a faint odor began to catch their attention. At first, it was barely noticeable, something that could easily be dismissed as trash left in the vehicle, or perhaps food that had spoiled. But the longer they stood near the car, the more distinct the smell became. It carried an unmistakable heaviness, one that didn't belong in a simple traffic stop. They looked toward the back of the vehicle, their instincts sharpening. The woman shifted in her seat, clearly aware of their growing suspicion. Her movements were stiff, as if she were trying too hard to appear calm. The silence stretched uncomfortably between them, interrupted only by the occasional crackle of the police radio. The officers had pulled over countless drivers before, yet rarely did a stop feel this unsettling. Something hidden beneath the surface was pressing to be found. What had begun as nothing more than a flickering taillight was turning into something far darker. The air around the car seemed heavier, the unease impossible to ignore. Neither officer could have predicted it in that moment, but this simple decision to pull over a routine vehicle would soon unravel a discovery that would shock the entire town. The officers made the decision to continue their inspection. Every movement seemed amplified by the tense silence surrounding the car. They instructed the woman to step out, and though she obeyed, there was a stiffness to the way she moved, as if her body carried a weight too heavy for her frame. She stood on the roadside, her eyes fixed on the ground, her face drained of color. The ordinary glow of streetlights above her only seemed to highlight how out of place she was in this moment. When the officers moved toward the rear of the sedan, the faint odor that had unsettled them earlier grew sharper, stronger, and undeniably foul. They paused briefly, exchanging a glance that communicated far more than words ever could. The smell was not something they could dismiss. It clung to the air, seeping outward, impossible to ignore. Their hands hovered near the trunk as they prepared to open it, a quiet awareness settling over them that what lay inside would not be ordinary. The latch clicked, breaking the fragile quiet. As the trunk lifted, the darkness inside seemed to swallow the surrounding light. What the officers saw made them recoil instinctively. Two shapes lay hidden beneath layers of worn blankets, their outlines too distinct to mistake for anything other than human. The smell now fully revealed itself for what it was, the unmistakable stench of death. The air filled with its weight, coating every breath with dread. The bodies were motionless, pale skin visible through the gaps in the fabric. Their forms were positioned awkwardly, as though they had been placed in haste, without care or dignity. The blankets wrapped around them carried stains that told their own silent story. It was a sight both horrifying and surreal, and for a moment, time itself seemed to stand still. The mundane routine of a traffic stop had shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a crime that had been literally hidden in plain sight. One officer quickly stepped back, radioing for immediate backup. The other stood frozen, his eyes locked on the grim contents of the trunk. The woman, still standing by the roadside, remained expressionless. She didn't plead, didn't cry, didn't move. Her stillness unnerved the officers as much as the discovery itself. It was as if she had been waiting for this moment, resigned to the inevitability of being caught. Within minutes, flashing lights painted the street in waves of red and blue. Additional patrol cars arrived, followed by investigators and emergency responders. The once quiet neighborhood had transformed into a chaotic scene of sirens, radios, and hurried footsteps. Residents peeked from behind curtains and doorways, drawn by the commotion but too afraid to step closer. The sight of stretchers being pulled from ambulances confirmed to everyone that something terrible had been uncovered. The car, once unremarkable, now stood as the center of a mystery. Who were the victims? How had they ended up there? And why was this woman driving with them hidden in her trunk? Each question added to the weight pressing down on the scene. For the officers, the shock of the discovery was only the beginning. What had been revealed would send ripples far beyond that roadside, unraveling a story that none of them were prepared for. The investigation into the bodies began immediately, with detectives working late into the night to uncover who the victims were. Fingerprints and dental records confirmed their identities within days. The first was a 42-year-old man known for his involvement in small-time fraud schemes. The second was a younger man in his late 20s who had recently gone missing after failing to return home from work. Though they came from different backgrounds and lived in different parts of the city, investigators soon realized that their lives had intersected in troubling ways. Both men had been connected to the same underground network of illegal activities. The more the detectives dug, the clearer the picture became. Both victims had histories with extortion, intimidation, and deceit. They were not career criminals in the traditional sense, but they operated on the edges of society, using manipulation to take advantage of vulnerable people. Records showed that they often worked together, preying on those desperate for quick money. Yet in the weeks leading up to their disappearances, each man seemed to have gone in different directions. Bank statements revealed unusual cash withdrawals and sudden deposits that didn't match their usual patterns. Phone logs traced back to one number repeatedly appearing in both of their lives during the days before they vanished. That number belonged to the woman caught with them in her trunk. Her connection to the victims changed everything. What had at first seemed like a horrifying act of random violence began to look like the unraveling of a calculated series of events. Investigators pored over her financial records, uncovering transactions that painted a picture of control and leverage. She had ties to several people who owed her money, most of whom lived in fear of her sudden appearances and constant demands. The two men in the trunk were not outliers. They were part of a larger pattern. Detectives began retracing the days leading up to the victim's final hours. Surveillance footage placed one of the men near a cafe the woman often visited. Another video from a gas station showed her vehicle parked only a few feet away from the second man's car. The timeline was tightening. She had been in their orbit just before their lives ended, and though the exact circumstances of their deaths remained unclear, the evidence of her involvement grew impossible to deny. Rumors began to spread quickly in the community. People who once considered her an ordinary neighbor now recalled moments that felt unsettling in hindsight. She was described as private, sometimes unfriendly, and rarely seen socializing. The quiet mask she wore during the day concealed a world that few could imagine. For investigators, this double life was beginning to explain how she had maintained control without attracting suspicion. Still, the question remained. What had truly happened between her and the men in those final moments? Detectives suspected the bodies had not been killed inside the vehicle. The placement of the remains and the lack of blood suggested another location was involved. The woman's role, whether as the direct killer or as part of a broader plan, was not yet clear. What was certain was that the traffic stop had only scratched the surface of a deeper, darker network of secrets waiting to be revealed. The more investigators uncovered, the more the woman's life split into two separate images. On one side, there was the version everyone in town thought they knew. She worked quietly at a local medical clinic, keeping her interactions polite but brief. Coworkers described her as efficient, punctual, and almost invisible outside of her responsibilities. She never caused problems, never brought attention to herself, and seemed like just another ordinary resident blending into the rhythm of the town. Yet beneath that calm exterior was an entirely different life, one that had been carefully hidden for years. Inside her small home, detectives discovered ledgers filled with handwritten entries, each line detailing money owed, interest collected, and threats implied. Names filled the pages, many of them already familiar to police for being tied to financial trouble or minor criminal records. Alongside the ledgers, they found prepaid cell phones, dozens of them, each one tied to a different number. Some had only a handful of calls logged, while others showed constant activity. The pattern was unmistakable. She had been running an underground loan operation, exploiting desperation and trapping people in cycles of debt they couldn't escape. The two men found in her trunk fit directly into this scheme. Both had borrowed large sums, promising repayment that never came. As their debts grew, so did the pressure. The woman's notes described them in coded language, but investigators pieced together the meaning easily enough. She had marked them as a risks, a label that appeared next to other names, some of whom had vanished or relocated abruptly in the past year. The financial web she had built was larger than anyone expected, stretching across neighboring towns and pulling in people from all walks of life. The discovery shocked those who thought they knew her. Neighbors who once waved politely now remembered the nights when cars pulled up quietly outside her home, engines running for only a few minutes before disappearing again. Delivery drivers spoke about how she rarely made eye contact, always insisting on paying in cash. Even her co-workers realized they never truly knew much about her. She rarely shared details of her personal life, never mentioned family, and never joined outings after work. She had constructed a version of herself that was entirely functional but completely hollow. For investigators, the evidence suggested more than just financial manipulation. The careful organization of her notes and the scale of her operation pointed to someone who thrived on control. She was not simply a woman trying to make extra money. She was orchestrating a system that fed off fear and secrecy. The victims in her trunk were not random casualties. They were part of a pattern of enforcement that escalated when debts went unpaid. The strongest impression left on detectives was how ordinary she managed to appear while conducting such dangerous business. She blended into the community, hiding in plain sight, while behind closed doors she operated as someone entirely different. This double life made her harder to track and even harder to understand. Every new piece of evidence revealed a woman who was far from a victim of circumstance. She had chosen this path, built it carefully, and kept it alive for years. The two bodies in her trunk were proof that her hidden world had finally broken through the surface, and the mask she wore each day had begun to crack beyond repair. The case appeared solid at first. With two bodies in her trunk and clear financial connections tying her to both victims, prosecutors believed conviction was only a matter of time. The community braced for a trial that would finally explain the woman's motives. Yet as investigators pressed deeper into the evidence, new details emerged that shifted the entire narrative. Forensic teams analyzing the bodies discovered soil embedded in the victim's clothing, particles that did not match the areas around her home or her car. The fibers clinging to the blankets also carried traces of hay and wood shavings, substances not found anywhere near the suburban neighborhood where she lived. The clues pointed to another location, one far removed from the tidy life she had presented to the world. Detectives traced the soil to a remote property on the outskirts of town, a stretch of land thick with weeds and broken fences. The property was not listed in her name, but it was tied to a man identified in her ledgers simply as a partner. Neighbors of that property recalled seeing him there often, a man in his 40s who kept to himself and rarely ventured into town. He was known for being secretive, and some remembered the woman visiting him late at night, her car parked for hours at a time before disappearing into the darkness. Oh. When officers searched the property, the scene was grim. The barn carried signs of recent activity, with disturbed dirt on the floor and ropes discarded carelessly in a corner. Marks on the walls suggested a struggle had taken place. Though the man who owned the property was nowhere to be found, his presence lingered in every detail. Investigators began to suspect that the victims had not been killed by the woman at all. Instead, the evidence suggested they had died on the property, their bodies later placed in her vehicle for removal. The revelation created a troubling picture. If she had not committed the murders, why was she the one caught transporting the bodies? Was she protecting someone else, or had she been forced into cleaning up the crime? Her silence offered no answers. Throughout questioning, she gave nothing away, her face blank and her words minimal. She neither confessed nor denied involvement. It was as if she had accepted her role in the chain of events, regardless of whether she was guilty of the act itself. The missing partner became the center of the investigation. Warrants were issued, and his face spread across news reports, but he seemed to have vanished completely. Every lead trailed off into nothing, every tip ending in frustration. The possibility that he had fled the state grew stronger with each passing day. Meanwhile, the woman remained behind bars, facing charges that prosecutors now struggled to define. Without proof she had committed the killings, the case became less straightforward. For the town, the uncertainty was even more unsettling than the discovery itself. The idea that the true killer could still be out there weighed heavily on the community. What began as a simple traffic stop had revealed a network of secrets, a hidden operation, and a partnership steeped in violence. Yet it had also left behind a haunting question with no clear answer. Was the woman the architect of the crimes, or was she just the one left holding the weight of another's brutality? The truth remained locked away, known only to her, and perhaps to the partner who had vanished into the shadows.